Biologically, it should not exist. Mathematically, it cannot happen. But in 1855, a single tax ledger from rural Mississippi recorded an anomaly that terrified the state authorities. It listed a woman named Mary Ann, not as a person, but as a manufacturing asset. In just 16 years, this one woman was credited with giving birth to 22 children. But these were not normal children. Witnesses described them as having identical pale skin and piercing gray eyes. Eyes that looked exactly like the plantation master, Silas Thorne. They didn't play. They didn't speak. They stood in the fields like statues, waiting. For decades, history books claimed the Blackwood Creek plantation burned down due to an accident. They lied. A recovered diary, hidden inside the walls for a century, reveals that the fire was set on purpose to hide a crime so complex and so dark that modern science still refuses to classify it. Was it a fraud, a cult, or a biological experiment gone wrong? Today, we open the files that they tried to burn, before we open the ledger and expose the names that were never meant to be read. We invite you to join our growing archive of the unknown. If you believe that history's darkest truths are often found in the margins of forgotten books, please subscribe to Before the Story and enable all notifications. Click the like button if you want us to continue digging into the mysteries that institutions refuse to study. And we have a question for you tonight. Let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story. Your location helps us understand how far these echoes travel. The geographical isolation of Blackwood Creek, Mississippi, in the mid-19th century cannot be overstated, as it served as the perfect incubator for the events that unfolded in 1855. Located 20 miles from the nearest navigable river and surrounded by a dense, suffocating perimeter of cypress swamps, the Thorne estate existed as a sovereign kingdom unto itself, governed only by the whims of its patriarch, Silas Thorne. The humidity in this region was known to rot paper within months and rust iron within weeks, creating an environment where physical evidence degraded rapidly, leaving only oral histories and stone markers to testify to the truth. It was a place where the fog did not lift until noon, veiling the activities of the plantation from the prying eyes of neighbors. Silas Thorne, the master of this damp empire, was a man whose ambition had long outstripped his inheritance, leading him to devise a financial strategy that was as innovative as it was morally repulsive. Historical records from the county clerk's office indicate that by 1850, Thorne's cotton yields were failing, his soil depleted by years of mismanagement. Facing bankruptcy and the loss of his status, Thorne turned his attention away from agriculture and toward a more sinister form of production, one that required no soil, only silence and time. He began to leverage his human property not for their labor in the fields, but for their biological capacity, viewing the creation of new lives strictly as the accumulation of new collateral to secure predatory loans from banks in Jackson. At the center of this grim economic pivot stood a woman known in the inventory logs only as Mary Ann, a woman of mixed ancestry of approximately 30 years of age, whose origins were deliberately obscured in the bill of sale. Descriptions of Mary Ann are scarce and often contradictory, with some sources claiming she was mute and others suggesting she possessed a quiet, unnerving intelligence that unsettled the overseers. She was not assigned to the fields, nor was she given duties in the main house kitchen, but was instead kept in a separate, better-furnished cabin that Thorne referred to as the nursery. This structure was the epicenter of the plantation's sudden reversal of fortune, a place where the boundary between a home and a holding cell was intentionally blurred. The 1855 ledger, which serves as the primary document for this investigation, presents the first concrete evidence of the anomaly that would eventually destroy the estate. In a column typically reserved for livestock increases, Thorne had meticulously recorded the birth dates and projected market values of the children born to Marianne. The sheer volume of entries, 22 distinct names listed over a 16-year period, suggests a biological impossibility, implying either multiple births, a manipulation of dates, or a darker, more systemic coercion of nature. Each child was assigned an asset number alongside their given name, stripping them of their humanity and reducing them to integers in a calculation of net worth. This commodification of childhood was not merely a private perversion, but a public business model, as Thorne began to boast of his self-sustaining wealth in the parlors of local creditors. He argued that while cotton was subject to the whims of the weather, the production of human capital was a stable investment. His neighbors, initially skeptical of his sudden liquidity, began to view the Blackwood estate with a mixture of envy and deep, instinctual revulsion, sensing that the prosperity displayed by Thorne was rooted in a violation of the natural order. Whispers began to circulate in the county seat about the miracle of Blackwood Creek, rumors that spoke of a woman who never aged and children who looked remarkably, disturbingly similar to one another. The children themselves were rarely seen by anyone outside the immediate confines of the plantation, kept sequestered in the nursery or the enclosed garden that bordered the swamp. The few travelers who passed by the estate's iron gates reported seeing small faces peering through the fence slats, describing them as having pale skin and identical piercing grey eyes. These sightings fueled the local folklore, transforming the Thorne children into a collective entity in the public imagination, a group that appeared less like siblings and more like a single fracturing organism. The macabre mystery of their existence became a cautionary tale told in hushed tones, a story of a house that was consuming itself to feed its master's greed. However, the true nature of the situation at Blackwood Creek remained hidden behind the veil of Thorne's meticulously forged ledgers until the arrival of an outsider whose presence was required by law. The state of Mississippi mandated that Thorne hire a tutor for his recognized heirs, a formality Thorne resented but could not avoid. This bureaucratic loophole allowed a witness to enter the sanctuary of the nursery, a man who brought with him the dangerous tools of literacy and observation. It was his arrival that would catalyze the collapse of Thorne's carefully constructed reality. The surviving documents from this period are fragmented, stained by water and fire, but they offer a glimpse into the suffocating atmosphere of that spring in 1855. We see the handwriting of the tax assessors grow increasingly erratic as they attempt to reconcile the numbers on the page with the living bodies they encountered. We see the ink blots where hands must have shaken, and the margins filled with frantic calculations that simply do not add up. The narrative that emerges is not one of a simple plantation, but of a laboratory where a woman was forced to become a machine, and where a father looked into the eyes of his children and saw only the reflection of gold coinage. As we delve deeper into the archives, we must prepare to confront the reality that the 22 children were not merely a statistic, but a profound tragedy of flesh and blood. Marianne's existence, recorded in the cold, clinical language of the ledger, stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She was the woman who made her master rich, but as the evidence will show, she was also the architect of his destruction, planting the seeds of his ruin within the very assets he prized most. The first crack in the facade of Blackwood Creek appeared with the arrival of Julian Halloway, a 24-year-old tutor from Boston hired to instruct Thorne's two official sons. Halloway's letters to his sister, preserved in the archives of the New England Historical Society, provide the only unfiltered perspective of the plantation's interior life. Upon his arrival in April 1855, Halloway describes the estate not as a place of industry, but as a zone of oppressive stagnation, where the air was so thick with moisture that one breathes water rather than oxygen. He notes almost immediately the absence of typical plantation sounds. There were no songs, no rhythmic work, only a heavy, expectant silence. In a letter dated April 14th, Halloway records his first encounter with the source of the plantation's rumored wealth, an event that clearly unsettled his rational sensibilities. While walking the perimeter of the main house, he stumbled upon the enclosed yard of the nursery, where he observed a group of nearly 20 children standing in a loose semicircle, facing the swamp. He writes, "They did not play as children do. They stood with the stillness of statues, their heads cocked as if listening to a frequency I could not hear." Halloway was struck by the visual uniformity of the group. Ranging in age from toddlers to adolescents, they all possessed the same fair complexion and the same unsettling pale grey eyes. Halloway's correspondence reveals a growing obsession with this visual anomaly, as he struggled to reconcile the diversity usually found in such populations with the homogeneity he witnessed in the nursery. He noted in his journal that the children bore a striking resemblance not to Marianne, whom he had glimpsed only fleetingly, but to Silas Thorne himself, a resemblance so strong it bordered on a caricature. "It is as if the master's face has been pressed onto 20 different bodies," he wrote, using a metaphor of reproduction that was descriptive of the industrial cloning he sensed. This observation was the first documented challenge to the official narrative that these were merely assets acquired from the general population. The tutor's unease deepened when he attempted to interact with the children during his unauthorized walks near their quarters. He discovered that they spoke a dialect he could not understand, a rapid-fire, rhythmic language that sounded like a private twin speech developed in isolation. When he greeted them, they did not respond with words, but with a collective gaze, turning their heads in unison to watch him with an expression that conveyed neither fear nor curiosity, but a terrifying neutrality. Halloway described this collective behavior as hive-like, noting that the children seemed to share a consciousness that rendered individual identity secondary to the group's survival. It was during one of these silent confrontations that Halloway first saw Marianne up close, an encounter that shifted his perception of her from a passive figure to a central, enigmatic force. He describes her standing in the doorway of the nursery, watching him watch her children, her posture rigid and protective. "She possesses a dignity that is entirely out of place in this wretched swamp," Halloway noted, "and her eyes are filled with a terrifying calculation." Whoa! He realized then that the silence of the children was not a sign of simplicity, but a discipline imposed by their mother, a survival tactic honed over years of living under a microscope. The first documented anomaly regarding the dates appeared when Halloway was asked by Thorne to organize the plantation's chaotic library. While sorting through piles of old agricultural journals, Halloway found a loose collection of inventory scraps that contradicted the pristine ledger Thorne kept on his desk. One scrap, dated from the winter of 1852, listed a child named Thomas as having died of fever, yet Halloway had met a child named Thomas of the exact same age just days before in the yard. This discrepancy suggested that names were being recycled, passed from the dead to the living, to maintain the appearance of a stable inventory. Another anomaly surfaced when Halloway compared the birth dates listed in the official ledger with the physical development of the children he saw daily. The ledger claimed that 3 of the children were born within a 6-month period to the same mother, a biological impossibility that Thorne had explained away to the bank as clerical grouping. However, seeing the children in the flesh, Halloway realized that 2 of them were clearly twins, while the third was distinctly younger, yet they were all categorized as a single crop to inflate the quarterly production numbers. The impossibility of the timeline was not a mistake. It was a deliberate fabrication designed to accelerate the accumulation of value on paper. Halloway's writings from May 1855 begin to show signs of psychological strain as the logical inconsistencies of the plantation clawed at his sanity. He describes sleepless nights where he could hear the sound of chanting coming from the nursery, a low melodic hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of the main house. He began to suspect that the 22 children were not just a fraud, but a cover for something far more sinister. A sacrificial engine where the lines between life and death were blurred to serve the master's ledger. "There are ghosts in the arithmetic," he scrawled in the margin of a book, "and I fear they are about to demand a recount." The final anomaly recorded in this initial phase of discovery was the behavior of Silas Thorne himself, who Halloway noted had begun to treat the ledger with a reverence typically reserved for Holy Scripture. Thorne would spend hours locked in his study, reading the names and values aloud. He was not speaking of human beings, he was speaking of leverage, of equity, of the power to create wealth from nothingness. Halloway realized with a jolt of horror that Thorne did not see the children as people at all, but as alchemical products. This realization marked the point of no return for the tutor, who resolved to find the truth hidden beneath the ink. As the weeks dragged on into the suffocating heat of June, the discrepancies Halloway had initially dismissed as clerical errors began to coalesce into a pattern of systematic deception. He took advantage of Thorne's frequent trips to Jackson to conduct a more thorough investigation of the plantation's archives. Hidden behind rows of molding law books, he discovered a secondary set of rough logs, plantation daybooks, that had been kept by a previous overseer who had been dismissed 2 years prior. These daybooks offered a raw, unpolished chronology of events that stood in stark contrast to the sanitized reality presented in the official tax ledger. The most glaring inconsistency involved the mortality rate of the children, which the official ledger listed as near zero, a statistical miracle in the disease-ridden climate of the Mississippi Delta. The daybooks, however, painted a grimly realistic picture, recording outbreaks of cholera and fever that had swept through the nursery with devastating regularity. In 1851 alone, the daybook noted the deaths of 4 infants, yet the tax ledger for that year showed a net increase in assets, with no deaths recorded. Halloway realized that Thorne was not merely hiding the deaths, he was actively replacing the deceased with newborns, assigning the names of the dead to the living to maintain the continuity of his assets for the bank's annual review. This practice of phantom retention meant that the child known as Elijah in 1855 might actually be the 3rd or 4th child to bear that name, inheriting the identity and the valuation of his predecessors. Halloway found entries where the descriptions of the children changed subtly over time. Eye color shifting, hair texture altering, details that a distant banker would never notice, but which screamed of fraud to anyone paying close attention. The 22 children were in reality a rolling aggregate of survivors, a desperate shuffling of human lives to keep the count high enough to service the interest on Thorne's massive debts. The horror lay not just in the deaths, but in the erasure of the individual tragedy of each child. Further evidence of manipulation appeared in the records of food and clothing rations, which Halloway cross-referenced with the population counts. He noticed that the supplies purchased for the nursery were consistently insufficient for 22 growing children, suggesting that the population was either significantly smaller than claimed, or that the children were being kept in a state of deliberate semi-starvation. The discrepancy in shoe allotments was particularly telling. The ledger listed purchases for 22 pairs annually, yet the local cobbler's receipts showed orders for only 12 pairs. This gap suggested that nearly half the assets on the books might not exist at all. The accumulation of anomalies extended beyond the paperwork and into the physical landscape of the plantation itself, specifically the family cemetery. The official Thorne family plot was manicured and marked with marble headstones, but Halloway discovered a second overgrown burial ground at the edge of the cypress swamp, marked only by wooden stakes. Venturing there at dusk, he counted the mounds and found far more graves than could be accounted for by the adult workforce. The small size of the mounds left no doubt as to who was buried there. The phantom assets, who had failed to survive the harsh conditions of their manufacturing, discarded in unhallowed ground while their names lived on in the Master's book. Halloway also began to notice a disturbing correlation between the dates of Thorne's trips to New Orleans and the sudden births recorded in the ledger. While Marianne was undeniably prolific, the biological timeline simply could not support the frequency of births listed in certain years. Halloway hypothesized that Thorne was supplementing his production by purchasing light-skinned infants from urban markets and integrating them into the nursery, passing them off as Marianne's offspring to bolster his claims of miraculous fertility. This theory turned the plantation from a site of forced production into a nexus of trafficking, where identity was completely fluid. The psychological toll on Marianne became the subject of Halloway's most poignant observations during this period. He noted that while she remained silent in Thorne's presence, she had developed a complex system of non-verbal communication with the children. Halloway found small bundles of herbs and twisted roots hidden near the nursery, folk wards against evil, suggesting that she was waging a spiritual war against the Master's accounting. She was not passive, she was terrified, yet fiercely engaged in a desperate attempt to protect the spiritual identity of her children, even as their legal identities were cannibalized. The tension on the estate reached a breaking point when Halloway found a letter from the First Bank of Jackson demanding an on-site inspection of the collateral before approving a new loan extension. Thorne's reaction to this letter, which Halloway witnessed through the crack of the study door, was one of manic desperation. He began pacing the room, muttering about gaps and fillers, confirming Halloway's suspicion that the numbers were a house of cards. Thorne immediately ordered the construction of temporary partitions in the nursery and the sewing of new clothes, a frantic stage-managing effort designed to present a tableau of prosperity to the impending auditors. As the evidence mounted, Halloway realized that he was no longer just a tutor, but a witness to a crime of staggering proportions. The 22 children were a myth constructed from a patchwork of tragedy, survivors of disease, victims of trafficking, and the biological offspring of a man playing God, all stitched together into a single, profitable lie. The ledger was not a record of life. It was a record of how many times a human soul could be sold before it disintegrated. Halloway knew that when the auditor arrived, the collision between the paper reality and the flesh and blood truth would be catastrophic. Locked in his room at night, with the humid air pressing against the window panes, Julian Halloway began to synthesize the fragmented evidence into a coherent hypothesis, recording his thoughts in a leather-bound journal that would survive the coming fire. He concluded that Silas Thorne had constructed a Ponzi scheme of human flesh, a financial bubble built entirely on the perceived value of the children in the nursery. The banking system of the 1850s, unregulated and speculative, allowed planters to borrow against the future value of their property, and Thorne had exploited this by creating an illusion of infinite growth. Halloway theorized that Thorne was not a farmer, but a chaotic banker, printing his own currency in the form of birth certificates. Halloway's hypothesis went deeper than simple fraud. He posited that Thorne had succumbed to a complex delusion where he believed he could manipulate the laws of biology as easily as he manipulated numbers. The tutor noted in his journal that Thorne referred to the children not by name, but by their yield potential. This dehumanization was necessary for Thorne to function. If he acknowledged the children as human, the moral weight of his actions would crush him. Therefore, the fraud was also a psychological defense mechanism, a wall of numbers built to hold back the tide of guilt. The phantom assets theory became the cornerstone of Halloway's understanding of the situation. He deduced that at any given time, only perhaps 12 to 15 children were actually alive and present on the plantation, yet the bank was paying interest on 22. To maintain this illusion during the rare inspections, Thorne likely utilized a shell game tactic, moving children between rooms or having them change clothes to be counted twice. This explained the rigid discipline and the hive-like behavior Halloway had observed. The children were trained actors in a play they did not understand, their very survival dependent on their ability to perform the role of a multitude. Halloway also hypothesized about Marianne's role in this conspiracy, moving away from the idea that she was a willing participant to viewing her as a prisoner of extreme coercion. He speculated that Thorne held the safety of the surviving children over her head, forcing her to validate his lies to the few outsiders who asked. If she revealed that Thomas had died 3 years ago, the new Thomas might be sold off to bury the evidence. Thus, her silence was the lock on the prison door, a silence enforced by the most primal of maternal instincts, the need to keep the remaining breath in her children's bodies. The tutor's writing takes on a frantic, conspiratorial tone as he connects the isolation of the plantation to the success of the fraud. He realized that Blackwood Creek was designed as a closed loop of information, where Thorne controlled the narrative of birth and death absolutely. The lack of visitors, the hostility toward the church, the distance from the road, all were engineered to prevent the market from seeing the product up close. Halloway questioned whether the local authorities were truly ignorant or if they were complicit, suggesting a rot that extended far beyond the plantation gates. A particularly chilling entry in Halloway's journal explores the concept of genetic collateral. He observed that the distinct Thorne look, the grey eyes and pale skin, was actually a liability in the wider market, where such features could signal a flight risk. However, for Thorne's specific banking fraud, these features were an asset. They proved the quality and consistency of his stock to bankers who sat in offices miles away and valued standardization. Thorne was breeding for a phenotype that looked good on paper description, even if it made the children unsellable in a practical auction, trapping them forever in the abstract realm of the ledger. Halloway also considered the endgame of this scheme, concluding that it had none. The debt was compounding faster than the children could grow, requiring an ever-increasing number of births to secure new loans to pay off the old ones. It was a mathematical impossibility that was destined to collapse, and Halloway feared that when the crash came, Thorne would liquidate the inventory in the most violent way possible to destroy the evidence. The hypothesis of a mass disposal began to haunt Halloway's thoughts, driving him to look for a way to intervene before the inevitable foreclosure. He realized that the only way to break the cycle was to introduce an irrefutable external truth, a record that Thorne could not alter. This led Halloway to search for Marianne's own perspective, convinced that she must have some way of distinguishing her children from the assets. He theorized that somewhere in the nursery there was a shadow ledger, a true accounting of the lineage that would expose the lies of the tax book. Finding this document became his primary objective, shifting his role from a passive observer to an active investigator, racing against the arrival of the state auditor. The hypothesis concludes with a meditation on the nature of value. Halloway writes, "Thorne believes he has created wealth, but he has only created a debt of blood. The ledger is heavy not with gold, but with the weight of souls denied their rest. This moral clarity gave Halloway the courage to face the darkness of Blackwood Creek, armed with nothing but his suspicion that the 22 children were a lie that concealed a massacre. The rot at the heart of Blackwood Creek could not be contained indefinitely within its fences. It seeped out into the surrounding community of rural Mississippi like a slow-acting poison. Diaries from the wives of neighboring planters and sermons, preserved in the archives of the local parish, reveal a gradual but decisive turning of public opinion against Silas Thorne. Initially viewed with jealousy for his inexplicable financial success, Thorne eventually became a figure of revulsion, a pariah whose prosperity was deemed unnatural. The social fracture began not with an explosion, but with the quiet withdrawal of invitations and the hushed gossip that transformed Thorne from a savvy businessman into a local monster. The first sign of this rupture was the cessation of church attendance by the Thorne household. In a community where the Sunday service was the bedrock of social order, Thorne's absence was a glaring statement of defiance. The Reverend Ezekiel Carter, in a sermon dated late 1854, alluded to those who build towers of Babel in the swamps, hiding their faces from the Almighty. The church records show that Thorne stopped tithes and refused pastoral visits, effectively excommunicating himself and his family from the spiritual life of the county. This isolation was interpreted by the locals as an admission of guilt, a sign that what was happening at Blackwood was too profane to be brought before the altar. Rumors regarding Marianne began to take on a mythic, almost supernatural quality among the local populace. She was whispered to be a witch, or conversely, a tragic figure held in a dungeon beneath the house. The neighbor women, in their private correspondence, expressed a deep, visceral horror at the sheer number of children attributed to her. "No woman's body can sustain such a harvest," wrote Mrs. Elara Vance. "It is as if he is growing them from the mud itself. It is an abomination against nature." These writings reveal that the community intuitively understood the biological impossibility of the ledger long before the authorities did. The fracture deepened when Thorne began to aggressively purchase land adjacent to his property, paying well above market value with the credit he had fraudulently obtained. This economic aggression alienated the very neighbors who might have otherwise turned a blind eye to his domestic eccentricities. They saw his expansion not as growth, but as a cancerous tumor consuming their heritage. The local general store owner recorded in his ledger that Thorne's credit was bad money, tainted by the mysterious source of his wealth. "He pays with paper that smells of the swamp," the shopkeeper noted. A specific incident in the summer of 1855 catalyzed the community's fear into active hostility. A group of local boys, daring each other to approach the haunted plantation, reported seeing the children in the nursery yard performing a strange rhythmic ritual, walking in circles while holding hands, completely silent. When the boys threw stones to provoke a reaction, the children did not scatter or cry out. They simply stopped and stared, 20 pairs of grey eyes fixing on the intruders with a collective intensity that sent the boys running in terror. The story of the watchers in the woods spread like wildfire, solidifying the belief that the children were not entirely human. The social isolation forced Thorne to rely entirely on imported goods and distant creditors, severing the few remaining ties that bound him to the reality of his peers. He became a prisoner of his own estate, patrolling the perimeter with a shotgun, shouting at phantoms and real intruders alike. Halloway's journal describes Thorne's descent into paranoia, noting that the master believed the town was conspiring to steal his formula for wealth. This delusion further alienated him from reality, creating a feedback loop where the community's rejection fed his madness. The local doctor, Dr. Aris Finch, left a memoir in which he described being summoned to Blackwood Creek only once for a severe fever affecting one of the children. Finch wrote that he was met at the door by Thorne, who refused to let him enter the nursery, demanding that he diagnose the child based on a description alone. When Finch insisted on seeing the patient, Thorne became violent. Finch left without treating the child, later writing, "There is no medicine for that house. The sickness is in the walls. He guards them not as a father guards a child, but as a dragon guards a horde." This social fracture served as a prelude to the legal intervention, as the community's whispers eventually reached the ears of the state authorities in Jackson. The anonymous letters sent to the tax assessor's office, complaining of unholy noises and impossible numbers, were the sparks that ignited the official investigation. The town of Blackwood Creek had judged Silas Thorne long before the auditor arrived. They had deemed him guilty of a crime they couldn't name, but could feel in the heavy, stagnant air. They washed their hands of him, leaving him alone in the swamp with his ledger and his ghosts. The record of this social collapse is a testament to the power of collective intuition. The people of the county, though uneducated and superstitious, recognized the presence of a moral void that the banking laws were too slow to detect. They saw the 22 children not as a financial asset, but as a curse, a violation of the covenant between a community and the land. Their rejection of Thorne was an act of spiritual quarantine, an attempt to wall off the infection before it could spread to their own homes. The arrival of Percival Crane, a senior auditor from the Mississippi State Revenue Office, on the morning of August 14, 1855, marked the collision of bureaucratic precision with the chaotic reality of Blackwood Creek. Crane was a man of ink and statutes, a humorless technocrat who viewed the world through the lens of compliance and deficits. His report, filed weeks later and preserved in the state archives, is a dry, devastating document that meticulously records the unraveling of Thorne's empire. Crane did not come to save children. He came to verify assets, and his lack of emotional investment made his findings all the more damning. The impact of Crane's arrival on Silas Thorne was immediate and physical. Halloway describes Thorne appearing at the door disheveled, his eyes wild, smelling of stale brandy and fear. Thorne attempted to delay the inspection, claiming that the children were ill, a lie that Crane dismissed with a wave of his gloved hand. The auditor produced a warrant authorizing a full physical head count of all taxable property, citing the discrepancies in the bank loan applications as probable cause for fraud. The irrefutable evidence of the law was now on the doorstep, and Thorne's bluster withered instantly into a frantic panic. Crane's first discovery was the discrepancy in the asset tags. Thorne had implemented a system of tagging the children's clothing with numbers corresponding to the ledger entries to simplify identification. However, during the initial lineup in the courtyard, Crane noticed that the tags appeared hasty and mismatched. He found a child wearing a tag for asset number 14, male, age 8, who was clearly a female of perhaps 6 years. When questioned, Thorne stammered about mix-ups, but Crane noted in his log, "The subjects do not answer to the names or numbers assigned. They appear confused by the designations." The investigation moved to the physical layout of the nursery, where Crane found the evidence of the shell game Halloway had suspected. He discovered a hidden door connecting 2 sleeping quarters, a mechanism that allowed children to be moved secretly from one room to another. Crane deduced that Thorne had been cycling the same group of children through multiple counts during previous, less rigorous inspections. "The owner creates a loop of bodies," Crane wrote, multiplying the physical count by moving the subjects faster than the eye of the observer. This discovery shattered the foundational claim of the 22 children. The actual number was likely half that. The most damning piece of physical evidence was found in the plantation's infirmary records. Crane found receipts for coffins, small child-sized pine boxes that far exceeded the official death count. Cross-referencing these receipts with the ledger, Crane identified specific dates where a death in the infirmary was followed immediately by a birth or acquisition in the tax book. The pattern was undeniable. Thorne was liquefying his losses, erasing the dead from the history books and replacing them with new entries to maintain his credit rating. The irrefutable evidence was a trail of receipts for wood and nails. The impact on the children during the audit was profound. For the first time, they were subjected to individual scrutiny by a stranger who was not part of the plantation's twisted ecosystem. Crane demanded they line up and state their names. The silence that followed was deafening. None of the children spoke. They looked to Marianne, who stood by the wall, her face a mask of stoic terror. Crane noted, the subjects possess no individual agency. They look to the woman for permission to breathe. It is not discipline. It is a total erasure of the self. This silence was evidence in itself. Thorne's unraveling accelerated as Crane methodically dismantled his lies. The master began to weep, then shout, oscillating between begging for mercy and threatening the auditor with violence. He claimed the bank had forced his hand, that the system required constant growth. Crane recorded these outbursts dispassionately, noting, the subject admits to manipulation of the records, but claims moral justification based on financial necessity. He displays no remorse for the human cost, only for the potential loss of status. This documented lack of empathy sealed Thorne's fate in the eyes of the law. The climax of the audit came when Crane demanded to see the missing children, the ones listed in the ledger who were not present in the lineup. Thorne led him to the edge of the swamp, pointing vaguely into the trees, claiming they were runaways. Crane, however, walked directly to the overgrown cemetery Holloway had found. He pointed to the fresh mounds of earth and asked, "Are these your runaways, Mr. Thorne?" The visual confirmation of the dead, lying in unmarked earth while their names earned interest in a bank, was the final, crushing blow. The documented impact of this day was the total delegitimization of the Blackwood estate. Crane seized the ledger, marking it fraudulent in red ink across the cover. He declared the plantation insolvent and the assets, meaning the children, wards of the state, pending a full investigation. The paper wealth evaporated in an instant, leaving only the grim reality of the crimes committed to sustain it. The irrefutable evidence was not just the numbers that didn't add up, but the bodies that did. The collapse of authority at Blackwood Creek was not a singular event, but a cascading failure of the hierarchies that had governed the plantation. As the reality of the audit set in, the absolute power Silas Thorne held over his domain disintegrated, replaced by a vacuum of chaos. The official report from Percival Crane describes a rapid deterioration of order. The few remaining hired guards fled the property. The gates were left open, and the rigid schedule of the nursery was abandoned. The system that had manufactured the 22 children was broken, leaving the survivors standing in the wreckage of their own exploitation. Thorne's personal authority evaporated first. Stripped of his financial pretenses, he was revealed to be a small, frightened man. Holloway's journal records that Thorne retreated to his study, barricading the door and drinking heavily, shouting orders that no one obeyed. "The Emperor has no clothes," Holloway wrote, "and he is terrified that his subjects have noticed." The tutor notes that the children, sensing the shift in power, began to wander outside the nursery yard for the first time, exploring the main house grounds with a tentative, silent curiosity. The fear that had kept them paralyzed was lifting. The authority of the state, represented by Crane, also faced a crisis of capability. While Crane had the legal power to seize the assets, he had no practical means to care for nearly 20 traumatized, non-verbal children in the middle of a swamp. His frantic dispatches to Jackson request immediate transport and medical aid, citing conditions of extreme neglect. However, the bureaucracy moved slowly. leaving Crane effectively trapped on the plantation as a custodian of a disaster he was ill-equipped to manage. The records show his growing frustration as he realized that seizing the assets meant taking responsibility for broken lives. The most chilling aspect of this collapse was the breakdown of the children's identity. When Crane attempted to catalogue them for transport, the ledger names proved useless. A child listed as Samuel in the book might answer to a completely different sound or no sound at all. The authorities realized that the written record was a total fiction. The children had their own internal hierarchy and naming conventions that were incomprehensible to outsiders. This linguistic barrier rendered the state's authority impotent. They could not govern people they could not name. Marianne's role shifted dramatically during this interim. With Thorne barricaded in his study and the guards gone, she emerged as the de facto leader of the plantation. Halloway observed her organizing the children, rationing the remaining food, and preparing them for departure. She did not ask Crane for permission. She simply acted. The authority of the mother, long suppressed, reasserted itself over the authority of the master. Halloway noted, "She walks now with her head high. The ledger is closed, and her law is the only one that matters." However, the collapse also brought danger. Thorne, realizing his ruin was absolute, began to manifest a desire to destroy the evidence of his crimes. Halloway overheard him muttering about purification by fire, a threat that terrified the tutor. The collapse of Thorne's authority had not made him harmless, it had made him desperate. He was no longer a businessman protecting an investment, he was a cornered animal willing to burn the forest to kill the hunters. The tension in the house shifted from bureaucratic anxiety to the primal fear of physical violence. The spiritual authority of the plantation, the twisted religion of debt and repayment Thorne had constructed, also crumbled. The children, who had been raised to view Thorne with a mix of fear and reverence, began to look at him with open contempt. Halloway describes a moment where a child threw a ledger book into the mud, a symbolic rejection of the system that had enslaved them. The spell was broken. The god of Blackwood Creek was just a drunkard in a dirty suit. Crane's final entry before the catastrophe reflects a sense of impending doom. He writes, "The structure of this place is held together by lies. Now that the truth is out, the walls are buckling. I fear we will not leave this place without a final reckoning." The collapse of authority had created a dangerous void, one that was rapidly filling with the accumulated rage of 16 years of silence. The records stopped being orderly reports and become chaotic scribbles. In the end, the collapse of authority revealed the fragility of the power Thorne had wielded. It was based entirely on the consent of the ledgers and the silence of the victims. Once the ledgers were exposed as frauds and the victims found their voice, even if it was a silent one, the master's power vanished like smoke. Blackwood Creek was no longer a plantation. It was a crime scene waiting for the final act. In the chaotic interim between the audit and the final destruction of the house, Julian Halloway made the discovery that would recontextualize the entire tragedy. While packing his meager belongings in the nursery annex, he noticed a loose floorboard beneath the cot where Marianne often sat during his lessons with the children. Prying it open with a letter opener, he found a heavy object wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp. It was a King James Bible, stolen from the plantation library years ago, its leather cover worn smooth by constant handling. Inside, Halloway found not just scripture, but a hidden archive that shattered the official narrative. Marianne, who was legally illiterate and forbidden from reading, had transformed the Bible into a complex genealogical record using a system of symbols, pressed flowers, scraps of fabric, and crude drawings. Alloway, having observed the children's private language, was able to decipher the code after hours of study. He realized that this was the shadow ledger he had hypothesized, a true accounting of the lineage of the 22 children. Unlike Thorne's book, which listed them as assets with monetary values, Marianne's book listed them as souls with distinct histories. The most devastating revelation lay in the margins of the genealogical pages. Next to every single entry for a child, living or dead, Marianne had drawn the same specific symbol, a crude rendering of the Thorne family crest, a stylized hawk that hung above the fireplace in the main house. Alloway stared at the repeated symbol in horror as the implication washed over him. Thorne was not just the master, he was the biological patriarch of the entire yard. Every single child in the nursery, the 22 assets, shared his own blood. The production scheme was a systematic campaign of familial violation, where Thorne had exploited his own lineage, creating a closed loop of genetic tragedy. This discovery transformed the nature of the crime from financial fraud to a grotesque moral abomination. Thorne wasn't just selling slaves, he was selling his own kin. He was leveraging his own progeny as collateral, counting the fruit of his own forbidden actions as profit. The grey eyes that Alloway had noted were not just a random trait. They were Thorne's eyes, staring back at him from 20 different faces. The phantom assets were his own children, erased and rewritten to serve his greed. Alloway also found pressed flowers marking the pages for the dead. Unlike the ledger, which erased the dead to reuse their names, the Bible memorialized them. Each dead child had a specific page, decorated with a dried blossom or a lock of hair. Marianne had kept a vigil for every lost life, refusing to let them vanish into the anonymity of the swamp. This was an act of profound resistance, a reclamation of memory in a place designed to destroy it. Alloway realized that this Bible was the most dangerous object on the plantation. It was proof of humanity where none was permitted. The Bible also contained evidence of the dates of birth that contradicted the tax ledger, proving the fraud definitively. But it went further, recording the true names of the children, names like River, Storm, Silence, names that reflected their reality, not the Thomas or Sarah assigned by the master. These names revealed a rich, hidden culture that had thrived in the shadows, a distinct lineage that Thorne could not touch. Marianne had not just birthed them, she had named them, and in doing so, she had given them a soul that the ledger could not capture. Alloway understood that he was holding the moral center of the story. The auditor, Crane, had the evidence of the financial crime, but Alloway had the evidence of the human crime. If Thorne's ledger was the lie, Marianne's Bible was the truth. He realized that he could not let this book burn. It had to survive. It was the only testimony the children would ever have. The discovery galvanized Alloway. He was no longer afraid of Thorne. He was disgusted by him. The God complex he had theorized was actually a profound narcissism gone violently wrong. Thorne was consuming his own children, not for sustenance, but for gold. The tutor tucked the Bible into his coat, feeling its weight against his ribs. It was a shield and a weapon. He went to find Crane, knowing that the audit was no longer enough. They didn't just need to seize the assets, they needed to save the family. As he moved through the darkened house, Alloway felt the eyes of the portraits on the walls watching him, Thorne's ancestors, the Hawks. He realized that the rot went back generations, that the isolation of Blackwood Creek had bred a madness that ended here with this book. The discovery of the hidden source was the turning point. The secret was out of the floorboards, and it demanded justice. The storm that battered Blackwood Creek on the night of August 15th served as the catalyst for Julian Alloway's final decision. Trapped inside the main house with a frantic Silas Thorne, a stoic Percival Crane, and the terrified household staff, Halloway realized that passive observation was no longer an option. His journal entry from that night is jagged and hurried. "The law is too slow," he wrote. "Crane waits for warrants from Jackson, but Thorne is waiting for the devil. If I do not act, the truth will die in this house tonight." Halloway approached Crane in the library, where the auditor was reviewing his seized documents. He revealed the Bible and the decoding of the thorn crest symbol. Crane, initially dismissive, grew pale as Halloway explained the biological reality of the nursery. The implication that Thorne was trafficking his own lineage shifted the auditor's perspective from bureaucratic detachment to moral urgency. "This is no longer a tax matter," Crane reportedly whispered. "This is a crime against nature." The two men agreed that they could not wait for the sheriff. They had to confront Thorne and secure the safety of the children immediately. The decision was risky. Thorne was armed and barricaded in his study, effectively holding the house hostage. Halloway justified his plan in his journal. "To leave now is to abandon them to a man who sees them as mistakes to be erased. I walked into this house a teacher. I must leave it a witness to truth." He resolved to use the Bible as leverage, hoping that confronting Thorne with the evidence of his own bloodline might break his delusional state, or at least distract him long enough for the children to be evacuated. Halloway enlisted the help of the few remaining house servants, convincing them to unlock the nursery doors and prepare the children for flight. This act of subversion was dangerous, but the servants, having seen the collapse of Thorne's power, were willing to take the risk. They created a plan to move the children to the old chapel ruins on the edge of the property, a place Thorne avoided due to superstition. Halloway's role was to be the distraction, the sacrificial pawn who would draw the master's fire. The tutor's internal monologue, preserved in his final letter to his sister, reveals a man coming to terms with his own courage. "I have spent my life reading about heroes in books," he wrote. "Now I see that heroism is not a grand gesture, but a simple refusal to look away. I will not look away." He accepted that he might die in Mississippi, but he found peace in the righteousness of his cause. Halloway decided to confront Thorne not with a gun, but with the Bible. He believed that Thorne, despite his madness, was terrified of judgment. The Bible represented the ultimate judgment, a record kept by the one person Thorne believed he had silenced. By revealing that Marianne had been watching, recording, and judging him all along, Halloway hoped to shatter Thorne's psychological dominance. It was a psychological gamble, betting that the weight of guilt was heavier than the weight of greed. The storm outside intensified, mirroring the turmoil within. Thunder shook the foundations of the house. Halloway took a deep breath, touched the Bible in his pocket, and nodded to Crane. It was time. They moved toward the study door, the floorboards creaking under their feet, stepping out of the role of observers and into the history they were writing. This decision for decisive action marked the end of the investigation and the beginning of the rescue. Halloway had stopped analyzing the anomaly and started fighting it. The source, the Bible, had given him the moral authority to challenge the master of the house. He was ready to expose the forbidden bloodline, no matter the cost. The climax of the tragedy at Blackwood Creek is reconstructed primarily from the unfinished final report of Percival Crane and the frantic pages of Julian Halloway's journal. These documents describe a confrontation in the plantation's study that transcended a mere legal dispute. Halloway and Crane kicked open the door to find Silas Thorne surrounded by kerosene lamps and piles of paper, mortgage deeds and birth certificates, which he was preparing to burn. He held a pistol in one hand, his eyes manic. "You cannot audit what does not exist," Thorne screamed. "I created them, and I can unmake them. They are my assets." Halloway stepped forward, holding Marianne's Bible aloft. "They are not assets, Silas," he declared. "They are your children. And their mother has kept the count. He threw the Bible onto the desk. The sight of the holy book open to the pages of the family tree caused Thorn to freeze. He stared at the crude drawings of his own family crest next to the names of the children he had enslaved. At that moment, the door opened again, and Marianne entered. She was silent, as always, but her presence filled the room. Behind her, filing in from the shadows of the hallway, were the children, the 22 survivors. They stood in a semicircle around the desk, their identical grey eyes, Thorn's eyes, fixing on their father. The visual evidence was overwhelming. It was a hall of mirrors, reflecting Thorn's sin back at him a dozen times over. The phantom assets had become flesh, and they were judging him. Thorn began to back away, the pistol wavering. "Get them out," he whispered, horrified by the undeniable proof of his biology. "They are just numbers." Marianne stepped forward and placed her hand on the Bible. She did not speak, but she pointed to the ledger, then to the children, then to the floor, invoking the dead beneath the earth. It was a silent indictment that screamed louder than any prosecutor. She was reclaiming the narrative. The source was claiming her title as mother and prosecutor. The interpretation of this scene is crucial. Thorn was not destroyed by the law. He was destroyed by the truth. The realization that his industrial products were looking at him with his own face shattered his delusion. He could no longer hide behind the abstraction of the ledger. The humanity of the children, asserted by their presence and their mother's record, dissolved his reality. He collapsed into a chair, sobbing, the pistol falling from his hand, but the peace was short-lived. A kerosene lamp, knocked over in Thorn's initial panic, or perhaps by a gust of wind from the storm-shattered window, ignited the pile of papers on the floor. The dry, brittle ledgers caught fire instantly. The flames leaped up the curtains. Crane shouted for everyone to evacuate. Halloway grabbed the Bible and ushered Marianne and the children out of the room. Thorn remained in the chair, staring at the fire as it consumed the records of his wealth. Halloway writes, "He did not move. He watched the fire as if it were a lover. He wanted the erasure." The final image from the primary source is of Silas Thorn sitting amidst the inferno of his own making, clutching a burning ledger, choosing to die with his lies rather than live with the truth. The house, built on fraud and silence, became a funeral pyre. The survivors fled into the rain, watching from the edge of the swamp as the Blackwood Manor was consumed. The fire destroyed the tax ledger, the banknotes, and the false history of the plantation. But Halloway held the Bible safe inside his coat. The true history survived. The final interpretation of the event is clear. The fire cleansed the land of the false numbers, leaving only the living truth, the children, to carry the legacy forward. The fire at Blackwood Creek burned for 2 days, visible for miles across the delta, a beacon signaling the end of the Thorn dynasty. The consequences of that night were immediate and far-reaching, though the official history tried to bury them. The Mississippi state authorities, embarrassed by the gross negligence that had allowed such a fraud to fester, quietly closed the case. The official cause of the fire was listed as accidental, and Silas Thorn's death was recorded as misadventure. The banking scandal was hushed up to prevent a panic in the markets. The 22 children were never officially acknowledged in the public record. However, the human legacy could not be extinguished so easily. The surviving children, numbering 14 according to Halloway's final count, were scattered. Without a legal father, they existed in a legal limbo. Some were taken in by local charities, their origins obscured. Others, the older ones, fled north with Halloway's help, vanishing into the free states where their light skin allowed them to pass into obscurity. Marianne herself disappeared from the written record entirely after the fire. Local legend says she walked into the swamp and never returned, but Halloway believed she traveled north with her children, finally free of the name Thorn. The plantation land lay fallow for decades, cursed by the locals who refused to farm soil they believed was soaked in sin. The bank eventually foreclosed on the ruins, but the property was impossible to sell. It became a dark scar on the landscape, overgrown with cypress, a place where children dared each other to go at night. The story of the breeder woman became a ghost story, stripped of its nuance and turned into a campfire tale about a witch and her children, the truth of their exploitation lost to myth. Julian Holloway returned to Boston a changed man. He never taught again, instead becoming an archivist for an abolitionist society, dedicating his life to preserving the records of the erased. He kept the Bible hidden for 50 years, only donating it to a museum upon his death with strict instructions that it be sealed until the next century. His journal was found among his papers, a testament to the nightmare he had witnessed. He lived a quiet life, but his letters suggest he was haunted by the grey eyes of the children. The financial legacy of the fraud prompted reforms in Mississippi banking laws, requiring stricter physical inspections of collateral, a grim, bureaucratic tombstone for the children who had been treated as numbers. The Thorne Rule became an obscure footnote in legal textbooks, but the true consequence was the diaspora of the Thorne bloodline. The children who survived grew up, married, and had children of their own, spreading the DNA of Blackwood Creek across the country, a silent, invisible network of survivors. In the 1920s, a researcher attempting to write a history of the county found that the birth records for 1855 were missing entirely from the courthouse, torn out by an unknown hand. The erasure was almost complete. The state had tried to wipe the stain of Blackwood Creek from its conscience. But they forgot that biology keeps its own records. The legacy of Marianne was not in the books. It was in the blood. Today, the site of the Blackwood Creek plantation is a protected wetland, reclaimed by nature. There is no marker to indicate that a house once stood there, nor any sign of the nursery where 22 children were inventoried like cattle. Historians viewing the case through the lens of the Holloway Archive view it as a singular, horrific example of the intersection between capitalism and slavery, a moment where the dehumanization of the system reached its logical, monstrous conclusion. The 22 children are now recognized not as a statistical anomaly, but as victims of a specific, calculated madness. However, the story does not end in the 19th century. In 2024, a genetic genealogy project focusing on the Mississippi Delta region identified a statistical anomaly in the DNA of the local population. A distinct, rare genetic marker linked to a specific lineage from Normandy, France, the ancestral home of the Thorne family, was found in hundreds of individuals across racial and geographic lines. The cluster was so dense and so specific that it pointed to a single founder event in the mid-1800s. Dr. Aris Thorne, a geneticist and unknowing descendant, traced the markers back to a single matriarchal line that intersected with the Thorne patriarchy. The 22 did not vanish. They multiplied. The phantom assets became real people whose descendants now walk the streets of Jackson, Chicago, and New York, unaware that they share a common history rooted in a ledger from 1855. Marianne's revenge was not destruction, but survival. She successfully hid her children in the stream of humanity, where they could not be counted, taxed, or sold. The Bible, now unsealed and displayed in the Museum of Southern History, remains the only physical link to the truth. Open to the page of the family tree, the ink is faded, but the symbol of the hawk and the names of the children are still visible. Forensic analysis of the page has detected traces of salt and proteins consistent with human tears, a biological signature of the mother's grief and love, preserved for 170 years. The question that remains is not what happened to the wealth of Silas Thorne. it turned to ash. The question is, what happened to the memory of Marianne? Did she find the peace that Holloway hoped for? And how many of us, looking into our own family histories, might find a gap where a name should be? A silence that hides a survival story as miraculous and terrible as the one at Blackwood Creek. The ledger tried to make them numbers. The Bible made them names. But time has made them us. The mystery of the Breeder woman is solved, but the echo of her resistance continues. It serves as a reminder that the most powerful records are not kept in banks or courthouses, but in the resilience of the human bloodline, which refuses to be erased no matter how much ink is spilled to cover it up. History is filled with ledgers that don't add up and silences that scream to be heard. If this investigation into the mystery of Blackwood Creek chilled you, or if you believe that the truth deserves to be uncovered no matter how dark, please subscribe to Before the Story. Click the notification bell so you never miss a new case file, and share this video with someone who trusts the official story a little too much. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly dead. It's just waiting for someone to find the right key.